because I know that some people told me that they cannot be here now, but they want to see it later. Okay. Okay. I see some students from Messina joining. Hi. As I probably never mentioned that, but you know, Marco, we have an agreement with this wonderful doctoral, hello Sonia, with this wonderful doctoral school in Messina. It's a doctoral school in cognitive science. They were interested in our first cycle and still are in this cycle. So this became part of their doctoral activities.
Okay.
Following us ever since. And I will also meet them in person next week so they can tell me if they are content. Okay, I'd say we can start in 2 minutes if you're fine with it. Have you tried the presentation? The length is more or less 40-50 minutes.
Okay.
Marco, is the presentation around 45-50 minutes, right?
You're right.
Great. And can I announce the book you're working on?
Yes, I should.
Okay. It's not the actual translation of the Italian book, or is it?
Yes, it's a translation of the Italian book with the modification. Voila.
Well, it's okay. It's slightly with some editing. Also, because we all know that a translated book is never really the same thing. So far, so good. Oh, I can see the list of participants is slowly growing. Hello, my colleagues. Okay, last social media sharing for me. And then at 0.5, I think we can start. Images. Point. Okay. Well, if you don't mind, I'll start now. So let me start by saying welcome to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have here today Professor Marco MENIN. Marco MENIN is actually an associate professor from the University of Turin. Actually, he works in a study not far from my own in the department, but I must admit, this is the first time I actually listened to his work. I've recently closely similar topics, albeit with very different tools. As you know, this conference, this webinar, has been called the sciences of the face. And now today, most than in any other times, you will see why I'm using the plural sciences, because until now we have mainly spoken about cognitive psychology, but it's my deep idea, and this is an idea that is strongly shared by all the members of the program FACETS, which is the research project that is supporting this initiative, that in order to understand a complex object with such as the face, which has many facets indeed, you need to approach it from multiple perspectives. And now this year, our focus is the cultures of the face. It's okay how face and facial representation are affected by different cultures. And so I found it very useful to interrogate an expert such as Marco MENIN of a culture that is not spatially distant, as an anthropologist could tell, but mainly temporally distant and still in many ways very close to our cultural roots, such as is the culture of Europe, and especially French, if I'm correct, yes, during the Enlightenment. Marco is very knowledgeable about emotions in general. He's recently published a book on which we can say it's an overview of the cultural history of emotion, especially in philosophy. But his very specific topic is that of tears. Not from a psychological, not merely from psychological, but mostly from the point of view of an historian of ideas and history of culture. And indeed, his recent book in Italian is currently being translated for Oxford University Press, among the others. Albeit you won't find much of his writings in English, because he mainly works in French and with French people. But now we are very lucky because we'll have the chance to hear many of things that you found probably nowhere on the YouTube. So I will stop sharing my screen and my voice, and I will say again, Marco, it's a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You can see my presentation, no?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Marco Viola for the invitation. I'm very happy. And I apologize in advance for my English. That is very bad, I'm sorry. I needed to read my talk. And my talk, the title of my talk is Crime Faces, the Rhetoric of Tears in French Early Modern Philosophy. And I want to start my talk with two preliminary remarks, and in particular with two questions. The first question is, why tears? The act of shedding tears represents one of the most common alterations of facial expression. Weeping is a human universal. Through history and in every culture, emotional tears have been shed. Furthermore, weeping is exclusively human, since, as far as we know, humans are the only species that produce tears when experiencing certain emotions. Studying tears means, therefore, penetrate the mystery of the human condition. The second question is, why French culture? France's long 18th century constitutes a particularly productive historical period for examining the relationship between cognitions, emotions, and actions that people attach to the interaction with one's and others' faces. A new aesthetic and ethical code was formulated in this era, revolving around the intensification of emotions and the hyperbolic use of weeping, an act understood to attest to the authenticity of emotion be expressed. Precisely because tears are not a simple biological fact, but rather hang suspended between a natural immediacy on one side and cultural artifice on the other, the analysis of crying proved powerful, fascinating to the 18th century imaginary. Indeed, this phenomenon came to represent an exemplary testing ground for investigation of the enigmatic relationship binding the realm of physiology to that of psychology, or, as expressed by the period's most fashionable conceptual pairing, the physique and the morale. The first part of my communication is about the ancient conception of tears, in particular is about transcendent crying faces. A transcendent conception of weeping dominated antiquity and the Middle Ages. The only crying faces that received attention are those of an extraordinary humanity. The Greek collective imagination, for example, celebrated heroic tears, as in particular evident when reading Homer's poem. The extraordinary value attributed to heroes is accompanied by an acceptance of their mortality, and this acceptance manifests in the ostentation of emotional expression. The tears that Achilles pours out over the bodies of his friend Patroclus slain by Hector are paradigmatic. We can read in the Iliad, all as one the armies cried out in sorrow, and Achilles led the chariot. 3 times they drove their full-maned stallions round the body, Myrmidon soldiers mourning, and among them Thetis stirred a deep desire to grieve. End of quotation. While heroes are able to display their emotions and indeed cannot deny these emotions without denying themselves, the same privilege is not granted to the ordinary man. The only tears Homer explicitly throws upon, in fact, are those of commoner. Thersites became the object of ridicule when he cries after being beaten by Odysseus during the meeting of the Achaean chiefs. The transcendent value of the crying face is furthermore accentuated by the Christian tradition. Tears thus became the symbol of a privileged relationship with the divine, the ephemeral manifestation giving a visible form to the ineffable bond between God and his creator. Exemplary is the image of a weeping Jesus. I quote from Hebrews, who in the days of his flesh, having sent up prayers and requests with strong crying and weeping to him who was able to give him salvation from death, had his prayer answered because of his fear of God. While on the one hand, the tears does symbolize Christ's humanity, in that it was through crying that he was able to fully understand the condition of mortals, on the other hand, they also reveal his divine nature. The most well-known example of this point is represented by the miraculous tears he shed on the tomb of Lazarus, bringing his friend back to life 4 days after his death. I quote from John, and when Jesus saw Mary weeping and saw the Jews weeping who came with her, his spirit was moved and he was troubled, and say, "Where have you put him?" They say, "Come on and see, Lord." And Jesus himself was weeping. So the Jews say, "See how dear he was to him." In conclusion, it is clear that mythological and ancient tears belong to a truly transcendent and suprahuman sphere. These are vertical tears with the power to establish a relationship between the human being and the higher unknowable dimension. The second part of my communication is about the dry eyes of the wiseman. Unlike the ample space that occupy in the epic arena, in literature, and even in social ritual, think, for instance, of the Latin custom of keeping lacrimator was evaporation kept time for the process of mourning. However, tears have not rightful place in the philosophical sphere. Plato was undoubtedly the hardest critic of tears. He interpreted tears as the manifestation of a dangerous tendency for the passions to prevail over reason. Or, to borrow the famous metaphor of Phaedrus, for the crooked, heavy, heel-black horse to dominate the chariot of the soul. The condemnation of crime made its most explicit and historically influential appears in the Stoic ideal of the man without passions. The Stoic doctrine radically strips emotion of all meaning. It is based on the idea that nature has ensured the preservation and well-being of living beings by providing animals with instinct and humans with reason. Emotions, as framed by this perspective, are not based in nature. They are merely opinions or judgment generated by foolishness and ignorance. All emotion originate from seeing something in the world that does not actually exist and which cannot exist. And all passions must therefore be denounced as the empty and meaningless opinions they are. However, the very fact of living according to reason made wise men immune to emotions. They were men without passions. The Stoic anthropological model was characterized by apathy, that is, a condition of inner freedom understood as independence, indifference, and imperturbability with respect to human passions and emotions. As part of this model, tears were judged particularly harshly. Seneca's writing expresses the most significant example of this rigor, specifically in Consolations. In the Consolatio addressed to Gaius Julius Polybius, one of Emperor Claudius' freedmen who has recently lost his brother, Seneca presented a lengthy explanation of why weeping, an irrational manifestation of human weakness, is useless. And I quote from the Consolations, "We might go on blaming fate much longer, but we cannot alter it. It stands harsh and inexorable. No one can move it by reproaches, by tears, or by justice. Fate never spares anyone, never makes allowance to anyone. Let us then refrain from unprofitable tears. For unless reason puts an end to our tears, fortune will never do so. Look around, I pray you, upon all mortals. Everywhere there is ample and constant reason for weeping. Tears will fail us sooner than causes for shedding them." End of quotation. The third part of my speech is about the Traité des Passions, from heaven to earth. The sacred vision of crime dominated Western culture until the mid-17th century. There were sporadic references to natural tears, but by and large, analysis of crime continued to revolve around a supernatural conceptualization. Only in the 17th century, there were unprecedented absences in some specific fields to take the phenomenon of weeping from the heavens, where it had been relegated first by the Greek classical tradition and then the Christian one, and bringing it down to earth. Naturally complex and gradual, this process was particularly noticeable in French culture. In 17th century French, in fact, the treatment of lacrimal secretions developed in a specific literary genre, Traité des Passions. The aim of this book was to classify the main affections and all their possible variants. In Traité des Passions, crime began to be analyzed not only as a biological phenomenon belonging to the human being, but also as a possible tool to understand the influence that the dynamic of passion and emotion have on moral conduct. A different theory begins to oppose the Stoic idea of apatheia, that passions are morally negative, centered on the Aristotelian ideal of metropatheia. According to this ideal, the passions can be conceived of as an opportunity for exerting virtue, all too obviously they do not themselves constitute a virtue. This opposition between peripatetic scholastic ethics and Stoic ethics appears in many of 7th century Traités des Passions, especially in Nicolas Couffetor's Tableau des passions humaines and Jean-François Sénon's De l'usage des passions. You can see the title pages of these two books. Okay. The main objection mastered against the Stoics is the following. Having made no distinction between the different human appetites and therefore between the intellect and the senses, they did not realize that the use of reason could regulate every disorder of the passions. This critical position represents a diametrical shift in the evaluation of emotionality. Rather than pathological, evil elements positioned in opposition to virtue, the passions were neutral elements, the goodness or wickedness of which were not inherent but rather varied, as the title of Sénon's test suggested, depending on how they were used. The title is L'usage des passions. The Stoic idea of incompatibility between passions and virtues was definitively rejected in favor of the idea that the most proper exercise of virtue consists of the ability to guide the passion, bringing them out of the condition of neutrality. With this move, the Stoic perspective is finally overturned once and for all. Crime and virtue now constitute an dyadis rather than an oxymoron. By allowing the crime subject to transcend by allowing the crime subject to transcend his or her own individuality and identify with humanity in general, intellectual tears of pity are held up as the highest expression of a form of human morality that is both anchored in earthly and social values, but also disinterested. The impassive face of the Stoic wiseman, whose eyes always remain dry, gradually gives way to the image of Heraclitus weeping, the symbol of the compassionate philosopher. You can see a portrait of Heraclitus weeping. We can move on the part of my speech titled A Duel About Tears, Descartes versus Cureau de la Chambre. The 7th century philosophical debate on the value of crime can be summed up by the dispute between René Descartes and Marin Cureau de la Chambre. In the Passion de l'âme, Descartes provides an explanation of crime which, in modern terms, could be defined as somatic or peripheral, as it is based on the assumption that the body can react to stimuli in the absence of any cognitive activity. In fact, Descartes described a thermodynamic genesis of crime, which arises from mechanical phenomena of condensation of vapors in the eyes. We can read in the Passion de l'âme, to understand the origin of tears properly, we must observe that although lots of vapors continually issue from all parts of our body, there are none from which so many issue as from the eyes. This is caused by the size of the optic nerves and the multitude of little arteries by which the vapors get there. Just as wheat is composed merely of vapors which are converted into water on the surface of the part from which they issue, so tears are formed from the vapors that issue from our eyes. End of quotation. This explanation managed to account in a rather convincing way of the optical and lubricating function of tears, but it shows all its limits in the face of emotional crying. In the Cartesian theory, on the one hand, if the Cartesian theory on the one hand has the merit of strongly claiming the biological nature of crying, on the other hand, it runs the risk of making crying itself lose its specific prerogative of human emotion. Our tears do not ultimately differ in any way from the tears of animals, nor, and this aspect is more disturbing, from the tears of an automaton which had been taught to cry by reproducing on a chemical and mechanical level the processing underlying crying. In conclusion, the face, both his own face and the face of the others, does not assume any authentic philosophical relevance for Descartes. But while Descartes fails to offer a convincing philosophical explanation of the crying face and ends up dismissing the question, the challenge of explaining the philosophical meaning of tears was taken up in those same years by Marin Cureau de la Chambre, advisor and doctor of Louis XIV. Almost 10 years before Descartes wrote Passion de l'âme, Cureau de la Chambre published the first volume of Caractère des Passions. This work can be considered the founding contribution of the moral conception of crying that ended up enjoying success in the following century. While in Notre Traité des Passions, the analysis of weeping is marginal, aimed at shedding light of a moral general idea of emotion, in Cureau, crying became central. This centrality is further confirmed by the fact that the final volume of Caractère is eloquently titled Les Caractères des larmes. In this book, tears are characterized by a new and original element that radically changes the value attributed to them: eloquence. This particular element stems directly from Cureau's own characteristically social conception of emotion. I quote from Cureau, "Tears pertain to man not as a mere animal, but as a social animal. If the natural foundation and final cause of passion is civil life, then tears can no longer be compared to other bodily secretion, as Descartes, for instance, has suggested. Indeed, a tear is not a mere stupid humor, it is a feeling of the soul that is expressed through the soul so much that it can be considered a natural function." Cureau writes, "The soul seeks to manifest its state through tears." The crying face, from a peripheral theme of philosophical reflection, becomes in this perspective its propulsive center. It is the face expressing emotions that reveals the authentic nature of man, an emotional animal even before a rational animal. Cureau replaced thus the Cartesian analysis of the sphere of passions assessed from a physical point of view, that is, focusing exclusively on the relationship between the soul and the body, with a rhetorical examination of emotion, studying them as a language that enables different individuals to communicate morally. Introduced in effort to organize this complex enigmatic subject, the first distinction Cureau posits is a semantic one between plaire and larme, a distinction that went on to be used quite widely the 18th century. The first term indicates any physiological movement accompanying the act of crying, while the second connotates only and specifically, I quote, water dripping from the eyes. So all tears, you can see the quotation, all tears, larmes are crying, pleurs, but not all crying is tears. This terminological clarification may seem trivial, but in reality it allows the author to diverge significantly from author traité des passions. While for Descartes, tears are the manifestation of a passion, for Cureau de la Chambre, they are a specific passion, precisely because they are understood as larmes and not simply pleurs. Since the soul has a particular movement and motive during weeping, it necessarily experiences a particular passion. The assertion of the ambiguity, natural and semantic, of crying and the claim of a specific passionate status, essential and not accessory, are the premise of the complex taxonomy of tears that Cureau de la Chambre aims to outline. The initial distinction is the distinction between passion-based, pathological, and involuntary tears. There are three general types of tears: those that follow passions, those that accompany eye diseases, and those that Hippocrates calls involuntary, which may occur in conjunction with dangerous diseases. All things considered, the second and third type can be associated with mechanical or physiological tears. Disaster or tears that, in Cureau's perspective, can find an explanation in the system of Descartes. But Descartes commits the unforgivable mistake of confusing them with real tears, which are exclusively those that follow the passions. The passion-based tears have a very varied taxonomy. Cureau writes, voluntary tears are either true or false. Some of them are hot and some cold, sweet, bitter, and sour, thin and thick, small and big. Philosophics know of pleasant and unpleasant ones, moderate and excessive ones. Christian moral, finally, adds vain, evil, and good one. What is most striking is his introduction of the category philosophical tears, which are wholly distinct from religious tears. This distinction not only makes it necessary to address weeping from a moral perspective, it also clearly defines the legitimacy of this act. Tears are the tribute that human beings must pay to nature for our weakness, writes Cureau. There are times when tears are just and reasonable. It is up to morals to study them. And it is precisely this insight of Cureau that makes him the true forerunner of the 18th century conception of weeping. And we can finally move on to the analysis of the 18th century. The 18th century that introduced the difference between the tears that are a form of passion and the real emotional tears. A significant qualitative shift in the moral conception of tears took place in the following decades. From a rational discourse capable of understanding and evaluating weeping from the outside, this conception developed into a true moral larmoyant, in which tears became the subject of ethical thought. While in the 7th century crying is mainly linked to the notion of passion, characterized by a substantial passivity of the subject who suffers, during the 18th century it became one of the most significant examples of the doctrine of sensibility, sensibilité in French, centered on the contrary on the idea of one moral autonomy of emotion with respect to physiological organization. The sensibility of the soul, and I quote from the Encyclopédie, imparts a kind of wisdom about property, and it goes further than the penetration of the mind alone. Reflection can make a man of honor, but sensibility makes a man virtuous. In fact, this privileged link between tears, sensitive constitution, and morality appear in the entry player of the Encyclopedia, in which the anonymous author, after having argued that tears are the affect of all the violent emotion of the soul, asks rhetorically, how can tears dishonor a great man when the sensibility which produces them is a virtue? By then, a link had been firmly established between crime and moral sensibility. Although is what not always clear enunciated at the conceptual level. Nonetheless, this link led thinkers to explore with increasing urgency what had been defined one of the perennial strands of the cultural history of crime, that is, the distinction between good and bad tears, or we may say between authentical moral and insincere tears. The most surprising synthesis of this dichotomy is probably the one found in a pamphlet published in the English Weekly Journal, titled "Men, a Paper for Ennobling the Species." And we can read this definition. We may properly distinguish weeping into two general kinds, genuine and counterfeit, or into physical crime and moral weeping. Physical crime, while there are no real corresponding ideas in the mind, nor any genuine sentimental feeling of the heart to produce it, depends upon the mechanism of the body. But moral weeping proceeds from and is always attended with such real sentiments of the mind and feeling of the heart as do honor to human nature, which false crime always the basis. The philosophical redefinition of tears took place entirely within this polarity between physical and moral forms of sensibility. To bring out the complexity of the question, without any claim to be exhaustive, I will focus on three specific types of crime, theorized respectively by Diderot, Marmontel, and Rousseau. And these three specific types of crime brings out the growing philosophical centrality of the image of the crime phase, and are the difference between cerebral and diaphragmatic tears, the dichotomy between cold and warm tears, and the tears of sympathy. I want to start with the case studies, let me see, of cerebral and diaphragmatic tears, expressed by Diderot. Diderot, that deserved to be ranked among the great theorists of sensibility. According to him, lacrimal secretion were the privileged heuristic instrument for defining the status of emotions on the basis of a scientific analysis of interrelationship between mind and body. A good starting point for navigating Diderot's thinking about tears is the paradoxe sur les comédiens. Paradoxe sur les comédiens can be read as a traité des passions, written, of course, in the 18th century style, and more specifically, as a systematic investigation of tears. Not only are tears and emotional display repeatedly referenced through the text, but the work also provides readers with a detailed case studies of lacrimal secretion allowed on the basis of physiological, aesthetic, and moral elements. I want to focus on the most famous distinction introduced by Diderot, the difference between the tears of the heart, or the tears or diaphragmatic tears, the tears that flow by the diaphragm, and the tears of the brain. It confirmed and radicalized the division between naturalness of emotion and its moral efficacy. Diderot writes, extreme sensibility makes middling actors, Middling sensibility makes the lack of bad actors. Incomplete absence of sensibility is the possibility of a sublime actor. The player's tears came from his brain, the sensitive beings from his heart. For actors to be sublime, in other words, they do not need to experience authentic emotions. Rather, they must scrupulously represent the external signs of feeling in a way that deceives spectator, eliciting in them authentic emotions. For this reason, a good actor, writes Diderot, knows exactly when he must produce his handkerchief and shed tears. Through a series of funny and provocative episodes, I have no time, Diderot repeatedly emphasized the total disconnect between the inner coldness of the actor or the comedian and his or her ability to externally imitate emotions. This opposition between cold tears, the result of a sort of acquired emotionality, and warm tears linked to natural sensibility, can be seen in a tale recounted by Marmontel. He describes how Voltaire and then playwright Michel Jean Sédaine reacted in opposite way to the sight of a crying friend. Okay. Sorry. Diderot writes, so when Voltaire gets upset at simply hearing about some moving events and Sédaine remains cool at the sight of a friend bursting into tears, it's Voltaire with the ordinary man and Sédaine the man of genius. We can now pass to the opposition between cold and warm tears theorized precisely by Marmontel. The rhetorical value of the crying face, underlined by Diderot to the figure of the actor, is reaffirmed by Marmontel. Marmontel's work represents the most analytic expression of 18th century thinking on sentimentalism. In fact, Marmontel clearly realized that in order to preserve its persuasive power, literary pathos must be able to combine aesthetic and moral power. He was also perfectly aware that this delicate balance could not be achieved without an ability to represent and arouse emotion, as confirmed by the fundamental dichotomy he posits within pathos, within French pathétique. We can read the quotation. I call direct that kind of pathos in which emotion is communicated without changing nature. That is, when the same feeling of love, hatred, vengeance, etc., or which we are filled, is in turn transmitted to the soul of others. I call indirect réfléchi en French. That kind of pathos whose impression differs from the cause, for instance, when the quiet confidence of the innocent makes us tremble when it is threatened by a crime or impending danger. The first type of pathos is the one celebrated in the classical rhetorical tradition, and especially in Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria. Far from representing the highest form of eloquence, direct pathos often leads for Marmontel to excess, distorting pathos into a comic effect or even hypocrisy. In light of this argument, Marmontel argued for the superiority of pathétique réfléchi, that is a form of cold pathos, thanks to which the inherent dangers of pathétique direct can be avoided. While the second approach to pathos places the emphasis on the emotion of the speaker, the first constructs a strategy of persuasion centered on the recipient. We can read, indirect pathos, although it does not manifest itself equally forcefully, as much more. It infiltrates, penetrates, and imperceptibly takes possession of the spirits and finally teaches them, without them realizing, all the more certain in its effects, the more it seems to act without effort. The key to persuasion, therefore, lies not in the speaker directly manifesting his emotions, as previously believed, but in the indirect emotions he manages to provoke by constructing a certain show before the eyes of the audience. This mechanism is exemplified by the way Marmontel interprets William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and in particular Antony's diatribe. In the you can see a pictorial representation of this scene. In his eyes, this scene is a masterful example of the theory of tableau vivant, and the persuasive method inherent in indirect pathos. Antony does nothing but read Caesar's will, and this simply expression of his last will in favor of the Roman people fills these people with indignation and fury toward his murderers. We can now pass to the last part of my communication about the tears of sympathy, about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. While Diderot and Marmontel evaluate the moral function of the tearful face a posteriori, Rousseau rigidly evaluates it a priori. In light of this assumption, we might understand the vehemence with which Rousseau attacks theatre, the stage on which actors reproduce the external markers of emotions without actually having any of the corresponding feelings. Rousseau's condemnation of actors, the real focus of letter ad D'Alembert, can be summed up in the fact that their tears are in vain. To draw on Diderot's famous image, they flow from the brain rather than the heart, originating, Rousseau writes, a fleeting and vain emotion, which lasts no longer than the illusion which produces it, a vestige of natural sentiment so stiffed by the passions, a sterile pity which feeds on futility and which has never produced the slightest act of humanity. Rousseau is thus perfectly aware that the problem of the authenticity of sentimental displays far exceeds an aesthetic and sociological consideration on the theatre. It also encompasses the very possibility of attributing a moral role to emotion. The observation that crime may be transformed from something positive and genuine, the aperson we present to oneself and others, into a mere cultural artifice, a conventional code, is a confirmation that individual access to emotion is not in itself sufficient to ensure the goodness and legitimacy of such emotion. It is precisely this awareness that justifies the centrality Rousseau attributes to emotion in defining humanity, such a central role that he does not hesitate to connote existence itself in sentimental terms. In Rousseau's view, recited emotion unable to establish any moral relationship between individuals. We can read the quotation. People think they come together in the theater, and this is there that they are isolated. It is there that they go to forget their friends, neighbors, and relations in order to concern themselves with fables, in order to cry for the misfortune of the day. In conclusion, this kind of tear represents a selfish mood, a superficial emotion which is limited to celebrating the moment but does not develop into a lasting feeling and is not able to contribute in any way to effective action in the world. In the final account, when a man has gone to admire fine action in stories and to cry for imaginary miseries, what more can be asked of him? Is he not satisfied with himself? Does he not applaud his fine soul? Has he not acquitted himself of all that he owes to virtue by the homage which he has just rendered it? What more could one want of him? That he practice it himself? He has no role to play, he is not actor. In short, there is an emotional difference between immoral tears and virtuous tears in terms of both depth and breadth, while the former, designated as a fleeting and vain emotion, are characterized by a short-lived peak of intensity, followed by a rapid decline. The latter instead develop and mature into intimacy, facilitating the transformation of emotion into a moral sentiment can be shared directly with others. Rousseau seems justified in stressing the discrepancy between virtuous tears and immoral tears in light of the fact that he grants emotion a decisive guiding role in human conduct. In fact, it can be argued that it is the ambiguity of true tears which preserve natural innocence by elevating it to civil morality, that serves to redeem emotion from the kind of disrupture it might at first glance suffer due to the issue of simulated sentiment. However, the most recurrent criticism leveled at any philosophical theory seeking to posit emotion as the foundation of a moral position consists precisely in raising doubts about on the circumstantial and conventional nature of emotion itself. Ultimately, according to the critics, emotion always remains limited to a single occurrence, and thus it is not possible to develop a generalizable moral model. From this perspective, emotion can at most aspire to be a subordinate temporary moral role as a sensitive and biological substitute for reason. This objection evaporates, or at least loses much of its significance within Rousseau's conception of sensibility. By inseparably interviewing sensation and sentiment, physiological structure and moral order, Rousseau is able to assert without contradiction both the single occurrence of emotion and its universal validity. Emotion thus came to constitute the essence of any authentically moral relationship between individuals, since it's emotion that enables them to manifest the inner self externally. Rousseau writes, "Nothing ties hearts together so much as the sweetness of weeping together." According to this perspective, tears can be considered the most effective form of communication. Rousseau ascribed the build of language itself not to physical needs, as the sense he had argued, but to passion and moral needs. Beyond the nuance that can be discerned in individual cases, the analysis of moral crimes seems to forcefully show that Rousseau's theory of emotion is focused on the compassionate and the selfless nature of feelings. It is this nature that simultaneously guarantees both their universal validity and their infallible moral right, a right which is immediately experienced as such without its being related to any external parameters. These do not belong completely to human beings. Even though they do somehow encompass human complexity and mystery by virtue of belonging to the soul and body in a manner both harmonious and conflictual. A brief conclusion. This brave journey into the philosophical thought of modernity has brought out, in my view, the complexity and relevance that the enigmatic age of the crime phase covers in the understanding of the human being. Today again, in the era of the emotional turn, the history of ideas, but as with any discipline that aims to reconstruct an image of man, appears to be unable to do so without confronting for better and for worse the issue of emotions and weeping. In the knowledge brilliantly expressed by Alfred de Musset at the dawn of the 19th century, that, I quote, "the tears of the past fertilize the future." Thank you very much for your attention.
Let me unmute myself to clap so it can be heard. And let me say again, thank you for this very comprehensive presentation. Lots of stimuli here